It's official. India is the most taxed Asian country by the United States, with tariffs of 50% more for now than China. International failure is undergoing a complete transformation, marked by the intense rivalry between the United States and China, the war in Ukraine, and complex regional rivalries in Asia. In this shifting context, India is deploying a balancing strategy, seeking to navigate between its relationships and always in its own interests. But in recent months, the situation has become tense with Washington. Uncle Sam is trying to preserve his hegemony, and to do so is demanding more and more from his partners, like Europe or Japan. But India has decided to respond in its own way, even leading to a possible adjustment in its relations with its neighbor and rival, China. Cursed, even going so far as to refuse Donald Trump's calls in recent weeks, signaling to Washington that India, while not a rival, is far from being a vassal. The Sino-Indian rapprochement, symbolized by recent but cautious diplomatic exchanges, reflects a real policy dictated by the need to avoid strategic isolation in an increasingly hostile regional and global environment. Welcome to Terabellum. For about 15 years, the United States has considered India a key partner in their Indo-Pacific strategy, especially within the Quad, alongside Japan and Australia. However, this relationship has gradually weakened over the course of trade disputes, especially with the punitive 25% tariffs imposed in 2018 under the Trump administration. This was followed in 2019 by the withdrawal of the Generalized System of Preferences preferential status that had been granted to India. These measures undermined mutual trust and marked a turning point in bilateral relations. More recently, New Delhi's decision to maintain or even increase its imports of Russian oil, despite American pressure, has heightened these tensions. Washington sees this not only as indirect support for Moscow, but also as a clear sign of the willingness of emerging powers on the continent, like India, to resist American demands. At the same time, the United States' rapprochement with Pakistan, India's historic rival and a strategic ally of Beijing, has reinforced in New Delhi the feeling of American disengagement. This complex dynamic is further accentuated by the Russian position, which sees Pakistan as an alternative gateway to bypass sanctions. Under Western pressure, India has chosen to strengthen its ties with Moscow. During an official visit at the end of August 2025, Indian Foreign Minister Jai Shankar signed trade agreements aimed at doubling bilateral trade to reach $100 billion in the coming years. This strategic choice marks a clear break with the Western-dominated sanctions regime. Even worse, contracts for Russian oil imports to India are expected to increase in September. According to various traders, finally this diplomatic development resulted in a highly anticipated meeting between Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping, the first between leaders since 2019. This event highlights a more flexible Indian diplomacy, seeking to ease its relations with Beijing, strengthen its economic pragmatism with Moscow, and recalibrate its cooperation with Washington, which nevertheless remains an essential partner. Ultimately, this balancing act between tensions and diplomacy illustrates the assertion of an India seeking to preserve its strategic sovereignty in a world that is being reshaped. American pressure, far from breaking this dynamic, actually seems to accelerate India's reorientation toward a broader partnership with the Eurasian continent, in line with its ambitions for strategic autonomy. With $86.5 billion in annual goods exports to the United States, India is heavily dependent on the American market, its largest customer ahead of China. In total, bilateral trade in goods will reach more than $130 billion in 2025. The new American tariffs, raised to 50% since the end of August, hit particularly hard. The economic press anticipates a 0.8% drop in gross domestic product, and the government estimates that Indian growth could fall below 6% or even drop by almost half. In the affected sectors, textiles, jewelry, pharmaceuticals, seafood, and also leather, some sectors could see up to a 70% drop in exports to the United States, putting thousands of jobs at risk and leading to bankruptcy risks for local producers. Value-added tax also plays a role in competitiveness and the trade war. I'm not going to make a video for you about indirect taxation in India, but it includes excise duties, customs duties, and a national value-added tax that generally ranges from 5 to 28% for most goods. To support these exporters weakened by the tariff war, New Delhi announced a targeted reduction of value-added tax on certain sectors for the local market, thus aiming to stimulate domestic consumption and compensate for the drop in American markets. But this does not come without sacrifice. This value-added tax reduction will still mean $16 billion less in the Indian public coffers and will undeniably impact the budgets of Indian states, ranging from social assistance to vital infrastructure in the trade war. What you need to understand is that the loss of preferred access to the American market after its removal in 2019 is getting even worse with this new tariff war. India is expected to earn only $50 billion in exports to the United States in 2026, according to recent projections, compared to $86 billion in 2024-2025. However, unlike in 2019, India is not opting for direct retaliation, which had cost it preferential access. It is prioritizing trade diversification with agreements with the United Kingdom, new agreements with the European Union, Association of Southeast Asian Nations Russia, Brazil, as well as Canada and Mexico. It defends its purchases of Russian oil as a strategic imperative against global volatility, and is implementing fiscal and trade support measures for its export sectors. Finally, the Indian strategy now includes boosting local demand and making massive investments in infrastructure, and a fiscal policy designed to attract more foreign direct investment in order to make the Indian economy more resilient and less dependent on a single partner. However, there is another risk: the extension of American barriers to digital services, outsourcing, or even e-commerce, which make up 6% of India's gross domestic product. In this context, diversifying markets, fiscal flexibility, and structural transformation are major priorities. Modi and the Foreign Affairs Department have clearly understood this. Obviously, China quickly seized the opportunity that was handed to it on a silver platter by Washington, showing a concrete willingness to ease tensions during the August 2025 visit of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Invited by the Indian National Security Advisor, Wang Yi took part in the 24th round of special talks on the border, highlighting the progress made since the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa summit in Kazan in 2024. He recalled that despite a significant military presence on both sides of the line of actual control, the line of actual control we had already seen in video, peace and tranquility were generally maintained. He also welcomed the resumption of Indian pilgrimages to religious sites in Tibet, a symbol of renewed economic and cultural exchanges. During his talks with the Indian Minister of Foreign Affairs and Modi, Wang Yi emphasized a political and comprehensive approach to the border issue based on the 2005 agreement. Both parties agreed to form expert groups and strengthen their border management mechanisms in order to deepen delimitation negotiations and ensure the sustainable maintenance of peace. On the same occasion, Indian advisor Ajit Doval recalled that Sino-Indian relations must be based on what are called the three mutuals: respect, sensitivity, and mutual interests. He also emphasized the need should be for an Asian order, I quote, multipolar, and to strengthen the fight against cross-border terrorism, a context in which the closeness between China and Pakistan remains, as you know, a sensitive factor. More broadly, the Sino-Indian dialogue appears above all as a pragmatic tool for managing disputes. It is part of the continuity of two ancient and contrasting diplomatic traditions: Confucian heritage for China, Hindu influence for India, but both constrained by the imperatives of realpolitik and by American decisions. But the regional context weighs heavily on Sino-Indian bilateral relations, marked by Beijing's growing influence. China positions itself as a long-standing strategic ally of Pakistan and fuels Pakistan's offensive stance toward India, as illustrated by the 2025 aerial clashes, where Pakistan deployed Chinese-made military equipment and claimed, though without confirmation, successes against the Indian Air Force. At the same time, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor extends China's presence all the way to the port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea, heightening the perception of New Delhi's strategic isolation. To put it simply, and I refer you to the dedicated video, India is trying to break the containment imposed by China, which in turn is trying to break the containment imposed by the United States, who themselves are trying to contain China. Beyond Pakistan, Beijing is expanding its influence in South Asia through massive investments in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh, countries that have traditionally been in India's sphere of influence. Its strategic investments are part of a logic of protection against the American containment strategy and provide China with strong regional footholds, multiplying its geopolitical leverage. At the same time, Moscow continues to be a military partner and to support India, but its strengthened alliance with China limits New Delhi's diplomatic and strategic room for maneuver. It's a complex triangular game, like a three-cushion billiards match, where each player is driven to protect their interests while reacting to the decisions of the other two, creating a certain regional balance, even if it's fragile and shifting. So it's in this environment, increasingly structured around Beijing, that India is trying to defuse its border tensions with China, particularly through regular diplomatic dialogues and negotiations. This plan aims to preserve an autonomous strategic space and avoid the double constraint of simultaneous land pressure from China and its allies, and maritime pressure from American power. Moreover, the current Sino-Indian rapprochement follows a logic reminiscent of certain historical precedents, such as the Sino-American Détente of the 1970s, which arose from a shared desire to contain the Soviet Union. We observe that strategic rivals can occasionally cooperate in the name of pragmatic interests. Similarly, after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, India turned toward the West to compensate for the loss of its main ally, demonstrating its ability to adapt in a constantly changing international system. Today, this evolution takes the form of a tactical détente to prevent confrontation from jeopardizing all cooperation in Asia. India is seeking to buy time and ease diplomatic encirclement, while China is opportunistically taking advantage of an India whose growing alignment with Washington had until now posed a strategic challenge. Despite this calm dialogue, the disparities in power remain considerable, with China's gross domestic product approaching $18 trillion compared to less than $4 trillion for India, and Beijing's significant military and technological lead. Mistrust persists. This dynamic is fueled by the weight of historical memory, ranging from the 1962 war to more recent clashes such as Doklam in 2017 and Ladakh in 2020. At the same time, India, in its own interest, will always continue its naval cooperation with the United States, Japan, Australia, and even France, as demonstrated by the recent Malabar 2025 exercise. Beijing gets a respite to contain India in the South Asian region, while New Delhi gains time to deal with a diplomatic environment that is increasingly closing in around it. However, this détente is fragile and does not hide the deep divisions that persist in the Sino-Indian rivalry. The balance could be broken at any moment by a military incident, internal political developments, or an acceleration of ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. The major future challenge lies at sea, where Sino-Indian competitiveness is intensifying far beyond the Himalayan mountains. This diplomatic rapprochement therefore reveals less of a reconciliation than a pause in a global competition that is set to continue, turning this rival duo into a necessary, complex, and unstable partnership. Yet, this is enough to maintain a form of balance on the continent and promote peace. India and China can say it. Thank you, Donald. Remember to subscribe to the channel and click the bell to receive notifications. Feel free to like, share with those around you, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support is more essential than ever on YouTube in 2025. Thank you all for your loyalty. This was Quentin for Terra Bellum, and see you next time.